What if I told you that Ferrari isn't trying to make the SF-26 faster, but rather turning it into a tailor-made car for Lewis Hamilton just before Suzuka? Because what they are silently adjusting could completely change their performance in the Japanese Grand Prix and bring them closer, for the first time in 2026, to the real fight against Mercedes. But are these changes really enough, or are we facing another hidden limit of the project? Ferrari arrives at Suzuka at a completely different moment than the one it experienced just a few months ago, because this SF-26 was not born from improvisation or urgency, but from a total reconstruction of its philosophy after hitting rock bottom with the SF-25, and that changes absolutely everything, from how they understand the car to how they are developing it around Lewis Hamilton, who right now is the central axis of every technical decision the team makes before the Japanese Grand Prix. The first thing to understand is that Ferrari is no longer building a generic car for two drivers, but is molding the SF-26 specifically to fit Hamilton's needs, and that implies a profound change in the way in which the balance of the car is adjusted, because the Briton needs an extremely precise corner entry, a front axle that responds immediately, and a rear that does not betray him on long supports, something that in Suzuka is absolutely critical due to the nature of the circuit, where each corner chains with the next one and any minimal instability is paid with tenths or even serious errors. In this sense, Ferrari has focused much of its previous work on expanding the car's operating window, something that was already considered from the initial design with the front pushrod suspension, but that is now being exploited to the maximum to find a balance that allows Hamilton to attack without compromising stability, because the problem is not only being fast, but being consistent on a circuit that demands absolute confidence in every turn of the wheel, and that is where the SF-26 begins to show signs of evolution compared to its predecessor. But this adjustment is not only mechanical or aerodynamic, it is also energetic, because the new regulations require the hybrid power to be managed much more precisely, and Ferrari is pushing this section to the limit, seeking an energy delivery that is not only efficient, but also perfectly synchronized with Hamilton's driving style, which depends a lot on the progressiveness of the car to maintain a high minimum speed in the curve, especially in sectors like the first Suzuka, where each transition defines the lap time. Even so, there is a key element that conditions this entire scenario, and it is the competitive reality. Mercedes continues to be one step ahead, with a more complete car in terms of aerodynamic load, efficiency and power, which forces Ferrari to not make a single mistake in the setup. Because they cannot win only by pure speed, they need to optimize absolutely every detail, from the setup to the execution on the track, and that makes this adjustment process something much more delicate and decisive than it seems at first glance. Therefore, this Japanese Grand Prix is not simply the third race of the season, it is the first real big test for this new Ferrari and for the connection between Hamilton and the SF-26, because here we will see if all these previous adjustments really work under pressure, on an unforgiving circuit that has historically separated the good cars from the truly competitive ones, and Ferrari knows it, which is why every change they have made before Suzuka is not a coincidence, it is part of a much bigger plan that is starting to take shape right now. As Ferrari delves into the final adjustments of the SF-26 for Suzuka, the true complexity of the problem begins to appear, because it is no longer just a matter of adapting the car to Hamilton's style, but of doing so without breaking the overall balance of the car. And that is where the Scuderia is walking an extremely fine line, since each improvement focused on the British can have direct consequences in other critical areas of performance. The first big challenge is in high-speed aerodynamics, because Suzuka requires a car that generates confidence in long and fast corners, but Ferrari still has a clear disadvantage compared to Mercedes in downforce and efficiency, which forces it to compensate for this lack of performance with more aggressive adjustments in the setup. And that can take the car to an unstable area if it is not executed perfectly, especially on a track where the margin for error is practically non-existent. This is where one of the most critical points of the SF-26 comes into play, its dependence on energy efficiency, since the new regulations have completely changed the way in which the teams extract performance from the car, and Ferrari has decided to take this concept to the limit, trying to maximize the delivery of the 350 kilowatts electric, but that implies extremely precise management, because any imbalance in the recovery or delivery of energy can directly affect the behavior of the car in curves, altering the balance right at the most delicate moments of the lap. And this is where Hamilton plays an absolutely decisive role, because his driving style, based on maintaining a high minimum speed in curves and a very fine transition between braking and acceleration, forces Ferrari to fine-tune every parameter of the car, from the distribution of braking to the response of the hybrid engine, creating an almost millimeter configuration that must work in perfect synchrony, something extremely difficult to achieve on a circuit like Suzuka. where each sector poses a different challenge. But there is another factor that adds even more pressure to this scenario, and it is the competitive context, because Ferrari knows that it has no room to fail. The difference with Mercedes is not going to be closed suddenly with a single update, and that means that they need to maximize absolutely everything they have, every tenth, every adjustment, every strategic decision, because any mistake not only distances them from victory, but can make it evident that the gap is still too big, something that internally they want to avoid at all costs. At this point, the SF-26 stops being simply a car in evolution and becomes a risky technical bet, where Ferrari is trying to accelerate its development without losing stability in the process. And Suzuka will be the perfect setting to see if this approach works, or if, on the contrary, there are still structural limitations that not even all these adjustments can hide. Because when the car faces such a demanding circuit, reality always ends up coming to light. And this is where everything converges. Because after weeks of adjustments, simulations and changes focused on Hamilton, Suzuka is not only going to measure the performance of the SF-26, it is going to expose the complete truth of the Ferrari project without filters and without excuses, on a circuit that historically punishes any structural weakness and rewards only cars that are really well built from the ground up. If Ferrari has got it right with the direction it has taken, this is the point where it should really start to show, because all the key elements that have worked on high-speed stability, energy efficiency, the connection between driver and car are put to the test. At the same time in Suzuka, and that is where Hamilton can make the difference, not only because of his talent, but because of his ability to squeeze out complex configurations and push the car to the limit in conditions where others cannot, turning each corner into an opportunity to compensate for the shortcomings that the car still has. 26. But if something fails, if that millimetric balance that Ferrari has sought does not hold up under pressure, then the Japanese circuit is going to make it evident immediately, because there is no escape on a track like this, where every error is amplified and every weakness is repeated lap after lap. And that is where the real problem would appear. It would not be a question of adjustments, but of structural limits of the car that have not yet been resolved, something that would completely change Ferrari's narrative at the start of the season. Furthermore, this moment has a much greater weight than it seems, because it is not just about winning or losing in Japan, but about defining the direction of the development of the SF-26 for the rest of the year, since a positive result would completely validate the path they have taken around Hamilton, reinforcing the idea of continuing to evolve the car in that direction, while a negative result would force them to rethink key concepts, something extremely delicate in a season where every race counts and where Mercedes has already set a very high benchmark from the beginning. Therefore, beyond the final result, Suzuka represents a turning point for Ferrari, because here not only the present is evaluated, but the real potential of the project, and above all, if this new alliance between Hamilton and the Scuderia has what it takes to become a real threat in 2026, or if, on the contrary, they are still one step behind where they need to be to fight for the championship. And now the big question is inevitable. Are we seeing the beginning of the Ferrari that can return Hamilton to victory, or simply the best possible version of a car that is still not enough? Ferrari arrives at Suzuka with something it hasn't had for a long time. A clear direction, a car that finally has a solid base, and, above all, a driver like Lewis Hamilton fully integrated into the development, capable of guiding each adjustment towards a very specific objective. But at the same time, it also arrives with a reality that they cannot ignore, and that is that they are not yet the benchmark. They still do not have the most complete car on the grid, and that makes each decision absolutely critical. The SF-26 represents much more than just a new car. It is the result of a change in philosophy within Ferrari, a commitment to rebuild from scratch after past mistakes. And Suzuka is the first scenario where all these ideas are confronted with the truth of the track, where simulations and expectations are no longer valid, only real performance, consistency, and the ability to execute under pressure on one of the most demanding circuits on the calendar. If the adjustments they have made work, Ferrari will not only take a step forward, but will send a very clear message to the rest of the grid. That this project is serious, that Hamilton is once again a real threat, and that the Scuderia is on the right path to fight for victory sooner rather than later. But if not, if the weaknesses continue to appear on a track like Suzuka, then it will be clear that there is still a significant distance to close, and that development will have to be even more aggressive than it already is. Because in the end, it all comes down to this. Ferrari is not just fighting Mercedes, it is fighting against its own past, against the mistakes that have held it back in recent years, and the SF-26 is its most serious attempt to change that history, with Hamilton as the centerpiece of that renaissance, at a time where every detail counts and where each race begins to define the destiny of an entire season. And now, with everything ready for the Japanese Grand Prix, The final question remains in the air. Is this the starting point of the Ferrari that can return Hamilton to the top? Or simply the beginning of a path that is still longer than it seems? Let me know in the comments what you think about all this.